Shalom from Jerusalem. This is our video update number 3 on the 2015 Intercessors for Israel's International Prayer Conference. Last night, our precious brother Lance Lambert shared with us a message out of Zechariah 12, with the emphasis being, Behold, verse 2 and 3, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling unto all people round about, when they shall be in siege, both against Judah and against Jerusalem. And in that day I will make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all people. All that burden themselves with it shall be cut to pieces, though all the people of the earth be gathered together against it. And Lance pointed out that the restoration of Israel has caused great grief to the nations of the Middle East, the Muslim nations, and many other nations as well. But everyone who has tried to touch Jerusalem, which is the center of the Middle East conflict, has ended up drinking out of this, as he called it, this goblet filled with poisoned wine. And it makes them insensible. They do the craziest thing. Why is Jerusalem the center of the conflict? Because this city, the city of the great king, as it says both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, represents God. It's his city. It represents his name, his grace, his power. His house was here, the temple. His son died and rose from the dead here. It represents everything. Plus, of course, Yeshua is coming back here. Therefore, Satan hates Jerusalem. And what Lance pointed out to us is Zechariah 12 is very relevant for the world today. We see this coming to pass before our eyes with frightening speed, to be honest with you. But toward the end of the chapter, verse 9 and 10, we find that after the nations come against Jerusalem, all Jerusalem gets saved. I will pour out the spirit of grace and supplication, and they shall look upon me whom they've pierced, and they shall mourn for him as one mourns for his only son. And so we're not sure how the timing works on this, but we could be very close to some very momentous prophetic events. And Lance believes that this year, 2013, and I personally agree with him, we're going to see incredible events happening. We've been seeing it in the past. What those events are, we can only guess at. But we hope that all of us are ready. We have our discernment available. We watch and pray, and we're ready to stand with God's purposes for Israel. Now, when we gathered this morning, we felt that the first thing we should pray into in the first session was this whole issue of I will pour out my spirit of grace and supplication. God says a number of times throughout the Old Testament that when all Israel gets saved, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. And so we spent a good deal of time praying for Israel's salvation. Israel's salvation is ultimately for God's glory, and it will be by God himself. And we prayed out of Ezekiel 36, where God says, for my holy name's sake will I do this. Romans 11, where we see that God has a covenant to remove Israel's sins. Hosea 2, where somebody prayed that the Jewish people no longer call him Baali, my Lord, but instead Ishi, my husband. And then one of the other precious brothers prayed, give us a burden to continue in prayer for Israel's salvation until we see it with our eyes, hear it with our ears, understand it with our mind, and rejoice with you as it comes to pass. We also reminded the Lord of his precious love for his people. Then we went on and prayed for specific groups, and those of you who follow along with our prayer alerts every Friday know we often pray for specific groups. You're probably up on that. We're not even going to have to mention any of that. If you're praying along with us, may the Lord place on your heart a specific group. One of the specific groups, obviously, was the current government that is being formed. Well, when we came back in the second session, the current government coalition negotiations was on our heart. Headlines have Netanyahu and Yesh Atid, or Yair Lapid, agreeing together, and now they're looking to form the rest of this government. And like we said before, this could be an excellent government that can be security conscious as well as biblically justice conscious. So part of our prayer burden was to, as the parties are talking right now in the Knesset, they're talking, we're praying. We really wanted to keep the ultra-Orthodox Haredi out of the government. We have nothing against the Orthodox. They need Jesus just like the secular. We have nothing against the ultra-Orthodox. But they have had a burdening, don't even know how to say this. They've had a heaviness on the government in which the government cannot even get out from under some of the burdens they place on it. Otherwise, they threaten to leave, and then all of a sudden the government would fall. So there's enough parties that have been elected so that we don't need to have Shas, for example, who's in charge of the Interior Ministry, in there, or United Torah Judaism in there, manipulating the government to only take care of the yeshivot and to keep out people who are not Jewish in their sight. So we had a good time of prayer for that. We did remember that although, whether they're ultra-Orthodox or secular, that although they may be enemies of the gospel for your sake, all of these people, all of these Jews are still beloved for the sake of the forefathers. So that was the foundation for which we prayed for this government, that it would be formed to keep out the ultra-Orthodox from manipulating and twisting, so that there would be a fair deal, that the Orthodox would serve in the army as well. We asked the Lord to fulfill all his purposes that he has placed this government into office for. The government's not even officially started, but the negotiations are going on. We ask God to make his priorities the government's priorities. And then as we went on into praying specifically, some of the priorities were, God, make sure this government understands the peace process is over and finished. Make sure this government has a heart for Aliyah, and make sure this government is able to speak to the nations the truth that comes out of Israel. There were plenty of other things we prayed for. I'll just leave it at that for today. Continue to pray for us. It's tiring, it's a battle, but we're rejoicing because we do believe that our God is gaining the victory, even if we can't see it with our eyes. We'll see it as we continue to run this marathon of persistent prayer to see his kingdom come and his will be done here in Israel, on earth as it already is in heaven. Lehitraot, we'll see you tomorrow.